You are surrounded by fools, and it is exhausting. At first you believe your intelligence is your greatest advantage. You notice contradictions quickly. You see patterns others miss. You understand things that seem invisible to everyone else. But over time, something strange begins to happen. The clearer your thinking becomes, the heavier the world starts to feel. Conversations that should take 5 minutes stretch into endless arguments. Logic hits a wall. Certainty replaces curiosity. And you leave those interactions drained, not because you were wrong, but because being right suddenly feels pointless. The Stoics understood this long before our modern world tried to explain it. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself every morning that he would meet people who are arrogant, stubborn, and unreasonable, and that peace does not come from changing them. It comes from mastering your response to them. Because the real danger of foolishness is not ignorance. It is how easily it pulls your mind into anger, frustration, and wasted energy. The moment you stop trying to fix every mind around you and begin protecting your own clarity, something shifts. The world does not suddenly become wiser, but you become harder to disturb. Most intelligent people fall into the same trap. It usually begins with a simple assumption. They assume everyone else values truth. That assumption feels natural because it reflects how your own mind works. When you hear an argument, you immediately begin weighing it. You compare the idea with what you already know. You test it against logic, and if better evidence appears, you adjust your view. To you, that process feels normal, almost automatic. So when you explain something carefully, laying out clear reasoning and simple facts, you expect the same process to happen in the other person's mind. You expect them to pause, think, and reconsider whether their position still makes sense. In your mind, the goal of conversation is truth. But slowly, after enough frustrating experiences, a realization begins to form. Not everyone enters a conversation searching for truth. Many people enter a conversation protecting something far more fragile than logic, their identity. Once you see this clearly, many confusing interactions suddenly make sense. Think about the moments when you explained something clearly and watched the reaction change. Curiosity disappears, tension appears, reflection fades, and defensiveness replaces it. Their posture stiffens, their voice grows louder. The discussion slowly turns into something strange. Facts stop mattering, because the conversation is no longer about ideas. It becomes about status and identity. When a belief becomes part of someone's identity, questioning it feels personal. It feels like an attack on their intelligence, their competence, or their place in the world. And the mind reacts instantly. It does not open itself to learning. It closes to defend what it already believes. Psychologists describe this pattern through what is known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. It reveals something uncomfortable about human confidence. People with the least knowledge in a field often speak with the most certainty. That certainty does not come from understanding. It comes from the absence of it. When someone knows very little about a subject, they also lack the awareness needed to see their own limitations. Ignorance hides itself from them. It forms a kind of mental armor that keeps doubt away. This is why someone who studies a subject deeply often sounds cautious, thoughtful, measured, while someone who barely understands the basics may speak with complete confidence. One mind sees complexity, the other sees simplicity, and simplicity often feels powerful, even when it rests on fragile foundations. But the deeper difficulty is not ignorance itself. Ignorance can be corrected when curiosity is present. The real problem appears when ignorance becomes emotionally protected. The moment a belief becomes tied to pride, belonging, or identity, changing that belief becomes painful, and pain is something the mind avoids instinctively. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." That line reveals a quiet truth about human conflict. Many arguments are not really about the topic itself. They are about the emotions underneath it. When someone feels exposed or threatened, their reaction is rarely curiosity. It is defense. They protect the belief the way someone protects a wound. If reflections like this resonate with you, if you believe the mind should be trained with the same discipline we give to the body, consider subscribing. Not as support for a channel, but as a quiet commitment to sharpening your thinking and protecting the clarity of your own mind. This is why intelligent people often leave conversations exhausted. They enter expecting reason to guide the outcome. They explain their perspective clearly, believing clarity will produce understanding, but what they encounter instead is resistance. Every explanation feels like it hits an invisible wall, and the harder they push, the stronger that wall becomes. One person invests energy into explanation, the other invests energy into resistance. It is not balanced. What looks like a logical debate is often something very different, an emotional tug-of-war disguised as logic, and the longer it continues, the more energy it quietly drains from the person who still believes the conversation is about truth. Over time, this pattern begins to wear down even the most patient mind. The intelligent person starts to question their own communication. Maybe I explained it poorly. Maybe I should have chosen better words. Maybe I should have used a different example. But often the explanation was never the problem. The real problem was the assumption that explanation alone can overcome identity and emotion. Reason works beautifully when both people are searching for understanding. It struggles when one person is searching for validation. That difference may sound small, but it changes everything about the conversation. There is a quiet lesson hidden inside this realization. It does not suggest that logic is useless or that truth has no value. Instead, it reminds us that human beings are not purely logical creatures. We carry pride, fear, insecurity, and attachment into every discussion we have. Seneca once wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." In arguments, that suffering often appears as the fear of being wrong. When someone senses that fear, even unconsciously, their mind moves quickly to protect itself. Defensiveness rises before reflection has a chance to begin. The discussion becomes less about learning and more about preserving dignity. Understanding this dynamic changes how intelligent people interpret conflict. Instead of seeing every disagreement as a puzzle that must be solved with better reasoning, they begin to see the emotional structure beneath the argument. They notice when someone is defending an identity rather than exploring an idea. They recognize the difference between curiosity and stubborn certainty. And once that difference becomes clear, their response slowly begins to change. The conversation is no longer about proving who is right. It becomes about recognizing when the pursuit of truth has quietly been replaced by the defense of pride. And once that shift becomes visible, a deeper question naturally begins to emerge, one that changes how intelligent people approach difficult conversations from that moment forward. To understand why these conversations unfold the way they do, you have to look a little deeper into how the human mind actually makes decisions. Most of us like to believe that people examine facts calmly and then form opinions based on what makes the most sense. It feels reasonable to think that logic leads the way and emotions follow behind. But the truth is often the opposite. Many of the choices people make begin with a feeling and only later become wrapped in reasoning that tries to justify that feeling. This pattern was described clearly by Daniel Kahneman, who explained that the mind tends to operate through two different systems. One system is fast, automatic, and emotional. The other is slower, more deliberate, and guided by careful thought. When you look closely at everyday conversations, you start to see how often the faster system is in charge, long before logic ever enters the room. The first system moves quickly. It reacts to tone, body language, loyalty, pride, and fear. It produces opinions almost instantly because it is designed to help us respond quickly to the world around us. The second system, on the other hand, requires effort. It slows things down. It asks questions. It examines evidence and searches for patterns that make sense. That slower process is where careful reasoning lives. It is the part of the mind that enjoys examining an argument piece by piece, asking whether the conclusion truly follows from the evidence presented. Many people who value clear thinking spend a lot of time in that slower space. They are comfortable analyzing ideas, weighing different perspectives, and adjusting their conclusions when better information appears. To them, discussion is a process of discovery. This is why logical explanations often fail to land the way intelligent people expect them to. When you carefully explain a concept, you are speaking from the slower system. You are presenting information, laying out reasoning step by step, and hoping the other person will follow the same path of analysis. But if the other person is operating mainly through the faster system, the message arrives in a completely different way. Instead of hearing new information, they feel pressure. Instead of evaluating the argument, they sense friction. The discussion stops being about ideas and begins to feel like a contest. The more clearly you explain your reasoning, the more intense that friction can become. Your effort to clarify the issue can unintentionally amplify their need to defend their position. This imbalance creates a strange dynamic that intelligent people often experience without fully understanding it. One person invests time and energy into building a careful explanation. They search for examples, refine their wording, and try to make the idea as clear as possible. Meanwhile, the other person does not invest the same effort in examining the argument. Their role becomes much simpler. They reject the explanation quickly and repeat their original opinion. From the outside, it might look like a debate between equals, but the energy being spent on each side is completely different. One person is working hard to construct a bridge of reasoning. The other is simply standing on their side of the river saying, "The bridge is unnecessary." After enough of these experiences, a painful doubt sometimes appears. The intelligent person begins to suspect that the problem lies within their own communication. Maybe the explanation was too complicated. Maybe the words were chosen poorly. Maybe the argument should have been framed differently. That self-criticism can become surprisingly heavy because people who care about clarity naturally want to express ideas well. But the deeper issue often has nothing to do with the quality of the explanation. The real issue is that explanation alone cannot override emotional commitment. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You always own the option of having no opinion." That simple thought carries a quiet wisdom. When someone has already formed a strong opinion through emotion, they rarely exercise that option. The mind prefers the comfort of certainty over the discomfort of reconsidering what it already believes. Understanding this does not mean abandoning logic or lowering your standards for thinking. It simply reveals why certain conversations feel so draining. You are trying to engage the slower system in someone who is still reacting through the faster one. The discussion becomes uneven from the beginning. You slow down and examine details while the other person moves quickly from one emotional reaction to the next. Over time, this mismatch can create fatigue. You begin to feel as though every conversation requires more effort than it should. The truth is that your effort is not wasted because reasoning itself remains valuable. But the expectation that reasoning alone will change another person is what creates the exhaustion. There is an idea that has existed for thousands of years, yet many people still struggle to apply it in daily life. The Stoics observed something simple but profound about human behavior. Much of our suffering does not come from the world itself, but from the way we try to control things that were never under our control to begin with. This realization sounds obvious at first, yet its meaning becomes clearer when you begin to examine your own reactions to difficult people. Think about how often frustration appears when someone refuses to understand something that seems obvious to you. You explain carefully. You clarify your reasoning. You try to make your thoughts as clear and fair as possible. But instead of reaching understanding, the conversation becomes tense and circular. The harder you try to guide the other person toward the truth, the more resistance you encounter. What begins as a simple exchange of ideas slowly turns into a draining effort to manage someone else's thinking. This is where frustration begins to grow. When someone refuses to see something that appears obvious to you, the mind starts searching for ways to fix the problem. Perhaps the explanation was not simple enough. Perhaps the tone was too sharp. Perhaps another example will help. These thoughts can lead to long discussions that circle the same points again and again. The intention behind them is usually sincere. You want the other person to see what you see. You want clarity to replace confusion. But something unexpected often happens along the way. Instead of producing understanding, the effort produces tension. The other person feels pressured. Their mind becomes more defensive. What started as an attempt to explain something calmly slowly transforms into a subtle contest of pride. Seneca once wrote, "He who is brave is free." In the context of everyday life, that bravery often appears in a quiet form. It is the courage to let go of the need to control another person's thinking. When someone refuses to understand something, the immediate instinct is to keep explaining until they do. But the Stoic perspective invites a different response. Instead of forcing clarity into a situation where confusion has already taken root, it suggests stepping back and protecting your own calm. This does not mean abandoning reason or pretending that truth does not matter. It means recognizing that truth cannot be forced into another person's mind against their will. This realization can feel strange at first. Many people believe that intelligence should naturally win every argument. If an idea is supported by evidence, it should eventually convince anyone who listens carefully. But human conversations are rarely that simple. People bring their emotions, their past experiences, and their personal pride into every discussion. Those elements can create invisible barriers that logic alone cannot pass through. When you continue trying to break those barriers with more reasoning, the conversation often becomes heavier instead of clearer. The effort to correct the other person begins to cost more energy than the discussion is worth. There is a quiet turning point that arrives after enough of these experiences. You begin to notice that the moment you stop trying to convince someone, something surprising happens. The tension fades. The discussion loses its sharp edges. The other person may continue to believe what they believe, but the struggle between you disappears. That change occurs because the invisible contest has ended. The conflict was never truly about facts alone. It was fueled by the emotional need for validation. Once that need fades, the conversation no longer carries the same pressure. What once felt like a battle slowly becomes just another exchange of opinions. This shift often brings a sense of distance that can feel unusual at first. Not a cold distance, but a calm one. You listen without feeling responsible for correcting every mistaken statement. You observe without feeling compelled to respond to every flawed argument. The mind becomes quieter because it is no longer chasing recognition from someone who may never offer it. Instead of spending energy trying to control another person's understanding, you begin directing that energy towards something far more reliable, your own clarity. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." When that idea settles into your thinking, a subtle freedom appears. Distance in this context is often misunderstood. Many people hear the idea of detaching from difficult people and immediately imagine something cold or uncaring. They picture someone who withdraws from others, who stops listening, who stops caring about the world around them. But real detachment is not indifference, it is clarity. It is the quiet moment when you begin to see certain situations exactly as they are, instead of how you wish they would be. When that clarity appears, something shifts in the way you experience conflict. Conversations that once pulled you into frustration begin to look different. You notice the patterns more clearly. You see how certain arguments repeat themselves endlessly, how certain people circle the same ideas without ever examining them. And gradually you understand that trying to explain everything to everyone is not wisdom. It is exhaustion waiting to happen. Imagine trying to describe a beautiful building to someone who refuses to look at it. You could spend hours explaining the design, the structure, the balance of every detail, but none of it would matter if the other person refuses to lift their eyes. That is what many arguments resemble. The information is there, the reasoning is clear, yet the other person has already decided what they believe. When that decision has been made, more explanation rarely changes anything. It only creates more friction. Recognizing this is not arrogance, it is realism. It means accepting that understanding cannot be forced. It has to be chosen by the person who hears the explanation. This is why guarding mental energy becomes so important. People often treat their attention as though it is unlimited. They argue with strangers online, debate endlessly with co-workers, and carry the frustration of those exchanges long after the conversation has ended. But the mind has limits just like the body. Every difficult interaction demands emotional effort. Every pointless debate drains focus that could have been used somewhere more meaningful. Over time, those small drains add up. What begins as irritation slowly becomes fatigue, and fatigue slowly begins to shape the way a person sees the world. There is another layer to this pattern that many people do not notice at first. When someone repeatedly provokes you into arguments, they gain a certain kind of control. Not because they are correct, but because they can influence your emotional state. They can pull you into irritation with a few careless words. They can disrupt your concentration simply by insisting on something that makes no sense. When this happens again and again, your peace begins to depend on their behavior, and that is a dangerous position to be in. Your calm should never rely on the clarity of someone else's thinking. Expectation plays a surprisingly powerful role in this shift. When you expect every conversation to be rational, irrational behavior feels shocking. It catches you off guard. You feel compelled to correct it because it violates the order you expected. But when you begin to expect that many people will act from pride, emotion, or habit rather than careful reasoning, the surprise disappears. The moment of irritation that once followed their words becomes much smaller. You listen, you observe, and you recognize the pattern without being pulled into it. That fading urgency is where emotional freedom begins to appear. You are still aware of the conversation. You still notice the errors in reasoning, but the emotional charge behind those observations weakens. Instead of reacting immediately, you pause. Sometimes you respond calmly. Sometimes you choose silence. Both responses come from the same place, the understanding that your peace is more valuable than proving a point that will never be accepted. Another interesting change begins to take place when this mindset develops. People who once seemed powerful in arguments begin to lose their influence over you. Their words no longer provoke the same reaction because the emotional hook is gone. They may continue speaking with the same certainty as before, but the effect is different. The conversation becomes lighter, almost observational. You notice the patterns in their thinking rather than feeling trapped inside the argument itself. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." In the context of everyday conflict, that insight reveals something important. Many reactions happen automatically because we have not examined them. We respond with irritation because irritation has become a habit. But when you begin to observe that habit, you create space between the stimulus and your response. In that space, choice appears. You can decide whether the situation deserves your energy or not. This kind of detachment often surprises people who first experience it. They expect it to feel distant or isolating. Instead, it usually feels calm. You are still present in the conversation, still capable of listening and responding when necessary. The difference is that your mind no longer feels trapped in a struggle to correct every mistake you hear. The conversation becomes one small event within a much larger perspective. From that perspective, many conflicts lose their urgency. The need to prove yourself fades. The need to win every debate fades with it. What remains is a quieter awareness of how people think and how easily arguments can spiral when emotions take control. Once you see that pattern clearly, it becomes easier to step outside of it. And that step creates a form of freedom that is difficult to notice until you experience it. Over time, this clarity reshapes the way you approach difficult interactions. You listen more carefully, but you also choose your engagement more wisely. Some conversations deserve your full attention because both people are willing to explore ideas openly. Others do not. Recognizing the difference becomes one of the most valuable skills a thoughtful person can develop. It protects your energy and preserves your peace. That protection does not make you indifferent to the world. It simply means you no longer allow every careless opinion to disturb your mind. Instead of reacting to every statement that seems wrong, you begin observing how people think and why they hold the views they do. That shift from reaction to observation quietly changes the entire experience of dealing with difficult people, and it prepares the mind for an even deeper understanding of how influence truly works in human relationships. Many people assume that intelligence naturally expresses itself through correction. When something is wrong, the instinct is to fix it. When someone speaks with certainty about something that makes no sense, the impulse is to challenge it. But environments shaped by hierarchy operate differently. In those spaces, truth does not always move freely. Pride, status, and insecurity can quietly shape the atmosphere of every conversation. A person in authority may interpret disagreement not as a search for clarity, but as a challenge to their position. What might have been a simple discussion between equals becomes something more delicate. The intelligent person begins to recognize that understanding people sometimes matters more than confronting their mistakes. History quietly supports this lesson again and again. Many individuals who survived difficult environments did not do so by confronting every flawed decision directly. Instead, they learned how to move carefully around the personalities involved. They observed when speaking openly would help and when silence would protect them. They learned that wisdom sometimes appears in the form of patience rather than argument. Aristotle once said, "It is the mark of an educated mind to entertain a thought without accepting it." That idea reflects a subtle skill. You can hear an opinion, understand it fully, and still choose not to challenge it immediately. This does not mean you agree with it. It means you understand the environment well enough to choose your moment wisely. Consider how different this approach feels from the instinct to prove a point. The urge to correct someone arises quickly, especially when the error seems obvious. The mind sees a gap in reasoning and immediately wants to fill it. Yet in environments shaped by authority, that instinct can create unnecessary friction. A single correction, even when accurate, can trigger defensiveness in someone who feels their position is being questioned. The conversation shifts from the topic itself to the perceived challenge behind it. Once that shift happens, the original issue becomes secondary. What remains is a struggle over respect and status, and those struggles rarely lead to productive outcomes. This is where a quieter form of strategy appears. Instead of confronting every mistaken statement, the intelligent person begins to choose where their effort truly belongs. Sometimes the most effective move is not to argue at all. Sometimes it is to listen, acknowledge the other person's view, and continue working steadily toward the real objective. That objective may be completing a project successfully, protecting your professional stability, or simply maintaining a workable relationship. In these moments, silence can carry more strength than debate. It preserves energy and prevents unnecessary conflict while allowing you to focus on what actually matters. Of course, this approach demands something that many people find difficult. It requires releasing the constant desire to prove your intelligence. For thoughtful individuals, that desire often runs deep. When you have spent years developing your understanding of the world, it feels natural to want that understanding to be recognized. Being seen as competent, perceptive, or insightful brings a quiet satisfaction. But in certain environments, that desire can become a hidden trap. The more strongly you seek recognition, the more vulnerable you become to situations where recognition is withheld. Your sense of calm begins to depend on whether someone else acknowledges your reasoning. Carl Jung once observed, "Thinking is difficult, that is why most people judge." In many environments, especially those shaped by authority, quick judgments appear more frequently than careful reasoning. Recognizing this does not mean you must accept every flawed decision. It simply means you understand the psychological landscape you are moving through. When people feel threatened or insecure, their judgments often become rigid. Confronting those judgments directly can trigger reactions that close the door to meaningful dialogue. But patient observation leaves that door open. This patience changes the rhythm of your interactions. Instead of reacting immediately, you allow the conversation to unfold. You contribute when it serves the goal and remain silent when it does not. Over time, this approach creates a form of quiet influence. Others begin to notice that your words appear only when they carry weight. You are no longer speaking simply to prove a point. You are speaking with intention. And intention carries a different kind of authority, one that does not rely on confrontation to be effective. Eventually, the emotional landscape of these interactions transforms. The urge to defend your intelligence fades into the background. What replaces it is a steady focus on outcomes rather than appearances. You become less concerned with whether someone recognizes your reasoning and more concerned with whether your actions lead to meaningful progress. This shift produces a surprising sense of freedom. The energy once spent on proving yourself returns to you. Your attention becomes clearer, your patience stronger, and your mind quieter. And from that quieter place, a deeper understanding begins to form about how thoughtful people choose their battles and how influence often works best when it moves quietly rather than loudly. There is another realization that usually appears later, often after years of trying to correct every flawed idea that crosses your path. At first, the habit feels almost like a responsibility. When you notice weak reasoning or careless thinking, the instinct is to challenge it. You explain why the argument does not hold together. You point out the missing details. You offer better information. In many ways, it feels productive, even noble. After all, if someone sees a mistake, shouldn't they correct it? Shouldn't clear thinking be defended wherever it is threatened by confusion? Many intelligent people quietly carry this sense of duty. They believe that pushing back against poor reasoning is a form of intellectual honesty. And in the beginning, that belief feels energizing. It makes you feel engaged with the world around you. Each argument may seem small on its own. A few minutes explaining something here, a brief disagreement there. But every debate requires attention. Every correction demands focus. Even when the conversation remains polite, the mind must work. It analyzes the other person's reasoning, chooses words carefully, and tries to guide the discussion toward clarity. That effort might not feel heavy in the moment, yet over time the accumulation becomes noticeable. It is similar to carrying a small weight in your pocket every day. One day it seems insignificant. After months, the weight begins to feel unnecessary. You start to wonder whether it belongs there at all. This is where a quieter realization begins to form. The people who appear most calm are rarely the ones winning the most arguments. Instead, they are often the ones who choose their arguments carefully. They listen more than they respond. They allow certain statements to pass without correction. At first, this can seem surprising. You might wonder whether they simply missed the error or chose not to engage because they lacked a response. But when you observe closely, something different becomes clear. Their silence is not ignorance, it is selection. They understand that every conversation invites them to invest a portion of their attention, and they have learned that attention is one of the most valuable resources they possess. Epictetus once said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." That thought contains an unusual kind of wisdom, When you stop reacting to every mistaken opinion, some people may assume you have nothing to say. They might even believe they have won the discussion. But in reality, something else is happening. You are choosing where your energy belongs. Instead of proving yourself in every exchange, you are preserving the clarity of your own mind. That choice may appear quiet on the surface, yet it protects something deeply important. Attention works in a way that many people rarely consider. Whatever you focus on shapes your mental environment. When your attention constantly moves toward conflict, the mind becomes accustomed to conflict. You begin anticipating arguments even before they appear. Conversations feel tense because you are prepared to defend your position at any moment. Gradually, this mindset begins to color the way you experience everyday interactions. The world starts to look like a series of debates waiting to happen, and when that happens, the mind rarely finds rest. The Stoics recognized the value of attention long before modern psychology began studying it. They understood that the direction of your attention determines the condition of your inner life. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts." When your thoughts are constantly occupied with correcting others, happiness becomes difficult to maintain, not because the pursuit of truth is wrong, but because the constant effort to defend it can exhaust the mind. Protecting your attention means recognizing that not every flawed opinion deserves your focus. There is also a deeper psychological layer behind this pattern. Many intelligent people discover that arguing can become a subtle habit. It offers stimulation. It provides a sense of engagement and even a small rush of satisfaction when a point is made clearly. Over time, that satisfaction can quietly encourage the habit to continue. Without realizing it, the mind begins seeking opportunities to debate simply because the activity feels familiar. But habits rarely ask whether they serve our long-term well-being. They simply repeat themselves until we choose to examine them. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." That process often includes recognizing which habits quietly shape your behavior. When you notice that constant intellectual conflict has become a pattern, the awareness itself creates space for change. Instead of reacting automatically, you begin asking whether the conversation in front of you deserves your energy. Sometimes it does. Meaningful discussions can sharpen understanding and deepen connection, but many other conversations do not offer that possibility. They circle around fixed opinions without moving forward. Once this distinction becomes clear, the urge to respond to everything begins to soften. You start listening with a different intention. Rather than searching for errors to correct, you observe how people think. You notice which discussions invite curiosity and which ones revolve around pride. This observation changes your role in the conversation. Instead of feeling responsible for correcting every mistake, you allow some ideas to pass without interruption. The silence that once felt uncomfortable begins to feel natural. Over time, this shift produces an unexpected result. Your mind becomes calmer. The constant pressure to respond fades. Conversations that once drained your energy now pass by without leaving the same emotional weight behind. You still value clear thinking, but you no longer feel compelled to defend it at every moment. Instead, you preserve your attention for the places where it can truly make a difference. And when that discipline takes root, a deeper understanding begins to emerge about how thoughtful people protect their peace while still remaining fully aware of the world around them. Eventually, a deeper shift in perspective begins to appear. It does not arrive suddenly, and it rarely appears during the first frustrating conversation with a difficult person. It grows slowly through experience. After enough debates that lead nowhere, after enough attempts to explain ideas that seem obvious to you but remain invisible to others, something inside your thinking begins to change. At first it may feel like simple fatigue. The same patterns repeat, the same arguments circle back again, and the same resistance appears whenever clarity challenges pride. But beneath that fatigue lies a quiet realization. The real challenge was never the foolish behavior you encountered. The real challenge was learning how to manage your own reaction to it. This realization changes the entire way you interpret those interactions. Before, the focus was always on the other person. Why do they refuse to listen? Why do they hold on to ideas that collapse under the smallest amount of scrutiny? Why do they react with such certainty when the reasoning behind their claim is weak? These questions can consume a surprising amount of mental energy. They lead the mind into endless attempts to understand someone else's thinking, often without reaching any satisfying conclusion. But when the shift in perspective occurs, the focus moves inward. Instead of analyzing their behavior endlessly, you begin observing your own response to it. That observation reveals something important. Anger toward ignorance rarely improves the situation. In fact, it often strengthens the very behavior that created the frustration in the first place. When irritation rises, your tone changes. Your words become sharper. The conversation grows heavier, and suddenly the discussion is no longer about ideas at all. It becomes a contest of emotion. The other person senses the tension and responds with even greater certainty. What began as an attempt to clarify something turns into a cycle of escalating reactions. Each side becomes more committed to defending its position, and the original issue fades into the background. This is the moment when emotional entanglement quietly takes hold. The other person may not even realize it, but they have drawn you into their world. Their confusion becomes your frustration. Their stubbornness becomes your irritation. Their unwillingness to examine their thinking begins to shape your mood. The conversation leaves a trace that lingers long after it ends. You carry it with you while working, while resting, even while trying to focus on something entirely different. And the strange part is that the person who triggered that reaction may not feel any of this weight at all. Recognizing this dynamic leads to the most important change of all. Instead of trying to control their thinking, you begin controlling the distance between their behavior and your emotional response. The moment you step back internally, something remarkable happens. Their words may remain the same, their certainty may remain unchanged, but the effect those words have on you begins to fade. You hear the argument, yet you are no longer pulled into the emotional current behind it. The conversation becomes something you observe rather than something that controls your state of mind. This does not mean you stop understanding the flaws in their reasoning. In fact, the clarity often becomes sharper. When your mind is no longer clouded by irritation, you can see the pattern of their thinking more clearly than before. You notice the shortcuts they take, the assumptions they repeat, the conclusions they reach without examining the path that led there. But instead of reacting immediately, you simply recognize the pattern. The need to correct it loses its urgency because you understand that correction will only matter if the other person is willing to listen. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." In everyday interactions, this idea carries a quiet strength. When someone behaves irrationally, it is easy to mirror that behavior through frustration or sarcasm. But when you refuse to mirror it, the dynamic changes. The emotional current that once pulled you into the argument begins to weaken. The other person may continue speaking with the same confidence, yet their words no longer dictate your mood. You remain calm because your reaction no longer depends on their understanding. At this stage, intelligence becomes something different from what many people imagine. Early in life, intelligence often feels like the ability to correct errors quickly and explain ideas clearly. It feels like the skill of proving a point or winning an argument. But maturity gradually reveals another dimension. Intelligence becomes the ability to maintain clarity even when others around you are confused. It becomes the discipline to remain calm when the conversation invites frustration. And perhaps most importantly, it becomes the wisdom to recognize when engagement will lead nowhere. Seneca once wrote, "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more that is poor. In the context of intellectual conflict, the craving often takes the form of recognition. The mind wants the other person to admit the truth of your reasoning. It wants the conversation to end with acknowledgement that your explanation was correct. But when you release that craving, the pressure disappears. The discussion no longer needs to produce validation. It simply becomes another exchange of views in a world full of different perspectives. From that point forward, the way you deal with difficult people becomes quieter and more deliberate. You still recognize weak reasoning when it appears. You still value clarity and thoughtful discussion, but you are no longer compelled to react to every flawed idea that crosses your path. Your attention returns to the one place where it truly belongs, the discipline of your own mind. And once that discipline becomes the center of your focus, something remarkable happens. The chaos that once surrounded those interactions begins to fade, leaving behind a calm awareness that allows you to move through the world with clarity rather than conflict. At some point, a quiet realization settles into your mind. The world has always been full of noise, pride, and confused thinking. That will not change tomorrow, and it will not change because of one more argument. But something else can change. You can decide where your attention goes. You can decide which voices deserve your energy and which ones simply pass by like distant echoes. If this reflection resonated with you, take a moment to watch the next video on the screen. It will deepen this idea and show you another powerful Stoic perspective that can help you move through the world with even greater clarity. And thank you for being part of Stoic Journal.